I think, therefore I am. But I'm thinking all the time, and I don't know who I am. Am I? Are you? I'm in the middle of nowhere, and it's a good place to be. Welcome to Just Nowhere with Dr. Samuel Zinner.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Just Nowhere. This is Dr. Samuel Zinner at the mountain village of Aulla in Tuscany, Italy. Tonight we have a very special guest, Professor Marat Grinberg. Teaches film at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. And tonight we'll be talking about the Strugatsky Brothers, right, whose novel Roadside Picnic, right, was adapted by Tarkovsky in the film The Stalker. So we'll be talking about the Strugatsky Brothers novels, and also we'll be talking about Tarkovsky's film adaptation, the Stalker, and Tarkovsky's film adaptation of Stanislaw Lem's Solaris novel, so the Solaris movie. So without any further ado, let's join the conversation. My first question would be, there are two general points that I would like our audience, right, to be clued in on. The first would be, and you can choose the order you want to answer this in, but how did you get interested in the Strugatsky brothers, and what's your your main points in your research, if you can, and of course, who are or who were these Strugatsky brothers?
Yeah. Let's start maybe with the second one first. Who were they? So the Strugatsky brothers, Arkady, the older one, and Boris, the younger one, they were the premier sci-fi authors in the Soviet Union from late 1950s or really 1960s and on. Until first Arkady passed away, and then Boris outlived him by good 15 years or so. So they were incredibly popular and almost not almost, but really did achieve this cult status among their readers. And, the brothers always had difficulty with the censors and the regime, but increasingly so as they kept on writing, and so a number of their works that were not published officially, they circulated in samizdat and this clandestine publishing network and reached their readers that way. But yeah, they had an absolutely cult status. And the interesting thing about science fiction in the Soviet Union is that whereas in the West, in the United States, sci-fi kind of has this reputation as sort of a lower genre, right? As commercial, although that's also not true to a large extent, but that's kind of the sort of the reputation. It is different in the Soviet context. Some of the best literature written in Russian in the 20th century, and certainly in the second half of the 20th century, can be classified as sci-fi. And so that's the Strugatsky brothers, very, very prolific and fascinating, complex writers. And it's interestingly that in the context of the ongoing war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a lot of readers have been coming back to the Strugatskys and sort of finding almost a prophetic picture, in their works of what's happening now, but really looking for answers in their work. So I think their significance has only, for tragic reasons, gone up recently. In terms of how I came to them, well, I always was interested in sci-fi. Loved sci-fi, although I have to say, so I grew up in the Soviet Union and Soviet Ukraine and left when I was 16. And despite the fact that the Strugatskys were so popular, I did not read them, as a teenager. For whatever reason, they were not in our, on my parents' bookshelf, and so I came back to them later as a adult reader, as a scholar, and I guess twofold my interest in them. First, trying to figure out how their works function as an allegory, as a political allegory, as a subversive allegory. That's one one interest. Another interest is investigating the question of Jewishness in their work, and that's something that I'm always interested in as a scholar of Jewish literature, Jewish film in various languages. And the Strugatskys, they were half Jewish. Their father was Jewish, and this question has never been really investigated, almost never investigated in the manifold scholarship and just writing on their works. But as I started to read them and continued to read them, I was just astonished by how much of it is there. Certainly, kind of what I call between the lines, and you got to dig deep for that Jewish layer. But also a lot of it is explicit. In the works that were published, officially. And so that became my main interest, seeing how they were configuring Jewishness in their work, what it meant to them, what it meant to their readers, how they were responding to the Holocaust, in their work. And that became part of my long project, which has the end result will be out very soon in March, and that's my book, The Soviet Jewish Bookshelf, Jewish Culture and Identity Between the Lines, where I investigate post-Holocaust, post-World War II Soviet Jewish culture through this phenomenon of the bookshelf, and looking at how reading was, I would argue, one of the main, if not the main source of maintaining and bolstering Jewish identity in the Soviet Union, and looking at what Jewish knowledge was available, and how Soviet Jews read certain books. Of course, keeping in mind that pretty much any public manifestation of Jewishness, and certainly of Judaism in the Soviet Union, was minimal, and very often, again, certainly in the case of Judaism as a religion, prohibited.
Yes.
So the Strugatskys form they're a big component of this bookshelf, the reconstruction of this kind of Soviet Jewish intellectual psyche and milieu in the post World War II period. They're a significant portion of that.
Yes. I did read one of your online articles about the Strugatsky Brothers novel, Monday Starts on Saturday. And of course, once you're aware of this Jewish component, whether it's covert or overt,
Right.
in an alternating way, that really jumps out at you, of course, because of the Sabbath, right, and Saturday. You wrote that it's an optimistic, or it's considered an optimistic novel, but at the same time, they were working on this very pessimistic novel, Hard to Be a God, right, which is probably an anti-Soviet allegory. Could you comment on that? How long did that immediately jump out at you, that title, or did it take you a while to get to the Jewishness behind this? Monday Starts on Saturday, what it was about, really.
Yeah. Again, I sort of, when I came to that, and it was a recent translation of the of this book, and that's how I came to writing this review of it. And it is one of the most popular of their works, and the general kind of reception of it is that it really kind of conveys that spirit of the 60s. The 60s, being part of the 60s being what was called the thaw period. These liberalizing reforms initiated by Khrushchev that really kind of opened the window a little bit in the Soviet Union and ushered in a cultural renaissance in cinema, in literature, in theater, translations of Western literature. And that work, Monday Starts on Saturday, kind of really captured that atmosphere, and again seen by some as one of the last optimistic works that they wrote, and increasingly they would become much more despondent and just completely disillusioned in the Soviet project. And so, when I started to read again, I was just astonished how explicit Jewishness was in that novel, not just in terms of Saturday, the Sabbath, but all the references, and the book is about this institute of magicians. It's sort of kind of the Soviet Harry Potter to some extent, where all these magicians are working on finding kind of the mystery of life. And one of the main characters is the rabbi Ben Betzalel, who creates a golem. He's not so much a character, but sort of is in the background. And so it is, if you think about it, it is quite astonishing that this cult book, read by hundreds and hundreds of thousands, published absolutely officially in the early 1960s in the Soviet Union, talks about the golem and Ben Betzalel and all sorts of other things. And what is also astonishing is that none of that has ever been really discussed. Yeah, it sort of kind of completely flies under the radar. Which led me to this interpretation of the book, right? This Monday Starts on Saturday. That is that, kind of what they're really looking for, these magicians, is going back to that sacred source represented by Saturday and the Sabbath. And the interesting kind of the factual thing is that in the Soviet Union at that point, Saturday was not part of the weekend, right? Saturday was a working day. So by emphasizing Saturday, they are hinting at something. And of course, I'm not saying that the Strugatsky brothers were observant Jews. They absolutely were not, and they were deeply kind of agnostic and skeptical of any religious system. But at the same time, it shows that they were fascinated with Judaism and kind of very much invested in this idea of Jewish sacred heritage that can feed, their vision, their philosophical vision. So that's that book. And of course, yes, it very much kind of coexists with, Hard to Be a God, a much darker, much more pessimistic. Although if you compare Hard to Be a God with their subsequent works, there is still hope in Hard to Be a God. There is still an idea that intellectuals and reason at least have a chance of overcoming these sinister forces.
Right. There's a chance.
There's a chance. Right.
It's hard to be a god, but possible.
But possible, right? Right. Yeah. Whereas if you move on, in their body of work, that chance becomes really, really sort of, somewhere there and very, very hard to reach. Although if you come to what's probably, I would say, yes, their most significant novel, The Condemned City, Grad Обреченный in Russian, which was not published and was not even shown. I mean, as they were writing it, they absolutely realized that they just could never publish it, and had just a few copies. In that book, yes, there is also this idea of the select few, the select few intellectuals, which again in their mind very much kind of linked to the Jewish destiny, that can, if not change things, that at least amongst themselves,
right,
keep something going. Yeah, they would be distinct from this general malaise and terror.
Right. So it's reflecting the traditional emphasis in Judaism on learning. Right.
Absolutely.
Seeking wisdom, seeking knowledge.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
All right. That gives a good context. The group of magicians in the Monday Starts on Saturday, right? So you've likened that to Rowling, right? So, but you've also said that it's probably more similar in tone to PK Dick,
Hmm.
right? So could you elaborate on specifically why you go there? Is that because the Harry Potter stories and movies are more like for a younger audience and in a sense not so serious as PK Dick, or just how do you understand
Yeah,
this
yeah.
comparison?
Uh, I would say, I mean, just maybe a sort of on a plain level, just a convolutedness, right? I mean,
Mhm,
hard to be got again. I'm sorry, not hard to be got, but Monday starts on Saturday, despite the fact that it was so popular and usually would be read by teenagers or kind of
mhm,
adult, whatever that genre, the adult,
mhm,
young adult, right? Is that what they call it? But it is quite convoluted in terms of kind of what it describes, and there's a character who's split into two, lives in the past, and sort of kind of
mhm,
the temporal problem in the novel is quite complex, and it sort of has that Philip K. Dickian kind of
mhm,
convolutedness. Uh, but I would say even more so again in the other works, particularly in the Condemned City, that idea of parallel universes,
mhm,
which of course is a central idea in Dick, is also very much what the Condemned City is about, right? Which describes this
mhm,
parallel city that exists somewhere in this matrix universe that does have a relationship to kind of the reality that we ostensibly live in,
mhm,
but also exists on its own terms, and it's not quite clear what that relationship is between the two universes. And as I'm continuing now, kind of embarking on this new
mhm,
project, kind of the Soviet science fiction and Jewishness in Soviet sci-fi beyond the Strugatskys,
mhm,
and looking at some other authors, of which there were many. I'm also looking at this link between Philip K. Dick and Soviet sci-fi, and interestingly, Philip K. Dick was not translated in the
right.
Soviet Union, unlike the other, like Asimov or some other Heinlein, popular West American sci-fi authors that were translated and very popular in the Soviet Union. Dick was not,
Mhm,
uh, and yet still, the Strugatskys, for instance, read English, uh, so they
mhm,
could somehow, through various channels, obtain at least some stories. And of course, Philip K. Dick had a very interesting, bizarre connection with Stanislaw Lem, the great Polish sci-fi
yes,
author, who of
yes.
course was tremendously popular in the Soviet Union and was on very, very friendly terms with the Strugatsky. So I'm trying to find some of these channels by which kind of just factually
Mhm,
they could have access to Dick's work. But even if I don't find that, or those did not exist, kind of these things are sort of part of the atmosphere.
Yeah, I
And
wonder if Dick's widow Tessa might have some clues for you there.
right,
Um,
and his archive, I was looking at,
mhm,
hopefully traveling to his archive at California and seeing
mhm, mhm,
if there is anything there. But I think this idea, kind of these parallel universes, and kind of questioning the reality that we inhabit, as the true
mhm,
reality, is very much, I think, a part of kind of the Strugatskyan
mhm.
sort of thinking as well.
Yeah, that brings to my mind another one of their works, which is in English, at least the translation, 1 billion years before the end of the world. And there was a film adaptation. Um, I guess in English it would be translated the Days of Eclipse.
Hmm.
And I'm wondering how you react to, well, the basic plot, which maybe you could give us, but I'm interested in the conclusion, right? Because in fact, I'm interested in the conclusion to novels in general, right? But the Strugatsky brothers, of course, also, because the end of a novel, um, the it if it is ambiguous, right, this sometimes makes the work much more profound rather than being, clear cut pessimistic or optimistic or whatever it may be. It leaves you scratching your head, and then there's endless commentary, right, and different interpretations by exegetes, which right is always a good thing. But if it's clear cut, right, it's sort of right. No more creative exegesis, right, is possible. And in the 1 billion years before the end of the world, the end there, I wonder about is right. There's only this one scientist, um, Vecharovsky, I believe his name was, who is sort of battling the cosmos, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm left wondering: are we supposed to pity him, or are we supposed to admire him? Or is he right, or is he wrong? But anyway, could you, if you're familiar with that work well enough, could you give us a summary of it? Because I think it's also a very, um, it's had a lot of impact, I think, more than some of the others, just because it's one that has been adapted to film.
Yeah, yeah. I am certainly familiar with their work. I don't know if I can give you the kind of the plot sort of in details, because I haven't read it in a couple of years.
Sure,
But
sure.
in that work, though, I mean, and that's a kind of consistent theme in their writing, and that's a sort of classical philosophical issue, ontological, epistemological,
Yes.
and that battle between chaos and order.
Mhm.
And as they continue, writing and thinking, I think kind of their pessimism is that either option is not really working, right? Order is stifling, and leads to terror, right? Both political terror, but also kind of this existential terror. Chaos, while it does have this element of freedom, is also frightening, because if you give that freedom to the masses, they're going to misuse it. And in that respect, I think the Strugatskys are quite close to Plato, and Plato's Republic, especially kind of the Straussian interpretation, of the Republic, and we very much see it in the condemned city, right? That these select few, these intellectuals, which again I think in their mind is very much kind of linked to the Jewish fate in the world. They need to protect themselves, and they need to negotiate with all these horrible regimes, and they need to compromise, and they need to lie. If you can think about the lies that the philosopher king feeds to the masses in the Republic, just to protect himself. But that's kind of this dichotomy between chaos and order.
Interesting.
Is sort of where what they're thinking about, and in some sense that's also they're getting it from Stanislaw Lem.
Right.
And certainly open-endedness. Again, if you look at Monday starts on Saturday, there is a kind of conclusivity to sort of to the book, right? And maybe that's where that optimism comes from. As you go on, there's much more of that open-endedness and convolutedness, right? Again, in the condemned city, it's not at all clear what the relationship is between these two universes, and then the conclusion is very, very just bewildering. Writing about it, I compared it like to thinking about David Lynch's films. It's just there is no way that you can logically explain it, and even in fact later when Boris Strugatsky was asked, he was just saying, I mean, I don't know, right? There's just, that's not the question that we were asking, how you can logically explain it, and they're getting away from that logic as they develop in their thinking, which again I think makes it evocative of Philip K. Dick.
Right. Well, the contrast between chaos and order, I had not thought of that in the context of 1 billion years before the end of the world. So that's helpful. That's enlightening. I would summarize it as the plot summary is basically these group of scientists begin to make certain discoveries, and quote unquote, the universe puts all these obstacles in their way, right?
Right.
To prevent their dissemination of these discoveries, of the publication. And so one by one, right, this guild of scientists just give up battling the universe, right? Like
Hmm.
this. And in the end, as I said, there's only one left, right? And so I asked, so are we supposed to pity him or admire him, or was he right or wrong? So maybe the answer is this, like, yeah, well, maybe all of that, right?
Right. Right.
Simultaneously,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's a very good summary of the plot. And this is, of course, that kind of inconclusiveness and ambiguity. The Strugatskys get it from the great works of Russian literature, right? They're readers of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and
Gogol,
Gogol, of course, Gogol, right? Kind of
yes.
and that's sort of the interesting roots of sci-fi in Russian literature, right? That
Right.
a lot of them come from this grotesque, absurdist tradition in the 19th century Russian literature, where of course Gogol looms large,
Yes.
And so yeah, that ambiguity is definitely there, which again makes the Strugatskys, but in general, kind of the good sci-fi in 20th century Russian literature, as I said, some of the best works of literature written in it, right? It doesn't have that kind of schematic simplicity that sometimes you encounter
Right.
in sci-fi or an allegory. And I call it, discussing an allegory in their work, I call it detailed allegory. It's not simplistic. Kind of, if you look at C.S. Lewis's kind of critique of allegory, right? Sometimes it's sort of, 2 plus 2, and you can just easily sort of substitute what 2 stands for and what the other 2 stands for. With the Strugatskys, it's always detailed. It's historically loaded, which
Right.
eliminates this kind of very simplistic, interpretations, and they get it from the great Russian writers.
I see. Yes. Well, another example of a conclusion to a Strugatsky Brothers novel that has always engaged me. Again, I don't know how to process it, and that's the end to what in the English translation, Roadside Picnic,
Yes.
and it's very moving. When I first read it, and it still is, my first impression is always very moving. When the main protagonist is addressing God, and it's called a litany. At least I haven't looked at the Russian, but in the translation that I consulted, it's called a litany, and it says, let's see, if you really are all powerful, all knowing, right? Look into my heart. It just can't be that I want something bad. I can't think of anything except those words of his: happiness for everyone,
Yes.
free,
Yes.
and no one will go away unsatisfied.
Right.
So
Right.
at first, it's I always think, well, this very moving, very profound. But then I think, well, but is it a bunch of BS, right? In other words, all right, so he's talking to God, at least in Judaism. Right, God has the 13 attributes of mercy. So the essence of God is his mercy. And so God deals with humanity, right, according to the Jewish perspective, with mercy. Also deen, but the mercy always predominates over the deen, right? And so, right, so that's how I understand the protagonist, Rhetoric, when he says, it just can't be that I want something bad. In other
Right.
words,
Right.
God created us good, basically. I mean, we're capable of evil, but we're basically created in goodness. And so I can't think of anything except those words of his, right? So the his, right, is this man that Rhetoric is basically indirectly killed, or allowed to be killed. And his words: happiness for everyone, free, and no one will go away unsatisfied. It can be very profound, and yet it's very ambiguous because of the context. So ethically, what has just happened. So is there a big conversion here at the last moment or what? But anyway, I would say it's a good example. Again, this is a very good conclusion to a novel because it is ambiguous, at least to
Right.
me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have a particular take on that conclusion? I mean, it seems very powerful to me.
Yeah. Very, very powerful. And interestingly, I was just teaching Stalker
Uh-huh.
in my film studies course.
Yeah, the movie adaptation.
The movie adaptation, which of course is tremendously different from the,
Yes.
from the novel. And the Strugatsky did write the script for Tarkovsky, but essentially they, after many, many tries, they gave Tarkovsky what he wanted, which was not at all what they,
Right,
created in the text.
Yeah, a parallel universe version. Yeah.
Right, exactly, and they recognized it as that, as kind of his, very much, the film being his work. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. That conclusion is so dubious, right? And and of course, I mean, the kid that he takes to the zone, right, to get this truth, just essentially he sacrifices him so that he could get to the sphere, and here, at the end, this asking for now, let everybody be sort of content or satisfied. It does have these religious echoes, but it also has political echoes, right?
right.
Which by this point, again, the Strugatskys are growing so disillusioned with the Soviet project and the Soviet idea, which at the core was, very much messianic and millenarian, right? This idea that the Soviet project would actually be remaking history, would be remaking human nature, right? And so this idea of universal happiness, or at least contentment, I would say, again, kind of has this, both the religious and the political, but it's very dubious considering who he is. I mean, the Roadside Picnic is sort of a noir novel, right?
Yes.
If you think about film noir and these very morally, dubious characters, and of course the criminal world, and that's what we have in the novel. And the Strugatsky is going to deliberately set it in the West. It supposedly takes place in some Western town. I mean, that's how they were playing the games with the censors, because the objection would be, how can you be describing this and perhaps commenting on the Soviet reality this way? They could always say it's not, right? It's in the West, and it's a critique of the capitalist society. But in the novel, yes, it is it is a kind of this underground criminal world, and the zone, where all of this takes place. The zone, to the Russian ear, the Russian reader, immediately invokes prison, the camps. Yeah.
Yes.
And so yeah, that ending is, it's interesting when, I teach this novel, and, the students do want to read it optimistically. But then as we stop and start to think about it, it's clear that it's not that clear, not that clear at all.
Not at all. Yeah, happiness for everyone, free. In other words, right? You don't have to buy it like the capitalists. And yet, in the context in which this is stated, it really almost, on one level, you could hear it as a parody almost, right?
Absolutely.
On the whole
Absolutely.
Marxist
Yes.
attitude.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So well taken. Now, the Roadside Picnic, right? That functions as a metaphor, of course, in the book. Now, I'm wondering, excuse me, how do you see what this metaphor represents in the Strugatsky brothers more generally, just not in that novel? And that is, right, this idea that, right, these extraterrestrials have supposedly visited the Earth. They've left behind basically,
Yeah.
meaningless artifacts, just as meaningless as, what we would leave behind after a picnic, right? Apple cores, etc. Right. And so the idea here is, right, epistemological barriers, right? So how would we communicate with an extraterrestrial intelligence, or would we even be able to know it if it were staring at us in the face, right? And so this inability to recognize the other, to communicate with the other. Does that have some more general function throughout the Strugatsky Brothers works, or is that more specific just to this Roadside Picnic?
Yeah. No, I think it runs particularly kind of post, sort of the more mature Strugatskys, again,
All
kind
right.
of post, post Monday Starts on Saturday, maybe even post Hard to Be a God. I very much, and that's one of the kind of interpretations offered in the novel of what it means, the Roadside Picnic, this
Right.
image, right? I very much read it as a kind of post-human statement. In
All
other
right.
words, humanity is not what it thinks it is, right? We're not the center of the universe, right?
Right.
They came, whoever they are, they came, they looked around. Maybe they liked what they saw, maybe they didn't like what they saw. They left all this stuff, all this garbage behind, and they forgot about us.
All right.
Right? Humanity is not the the core of everything. And again, I think they're very much getting it from Stanislaw Lem.
Yes. Solaris.
If you think about Solaris, again, not Tarkovsky's, not misinterpretation of Solaris, certainly as Lam saw it. It's a deeply powerful film, but very, very different from the book. But
Yes.
but in Solaris, this idea is very strong as as well. Or even in Hard to Be a God, if you remember Rumata, right, the main character, when he finds this philosopher, I forget his name, and they have this conversation, right? If you saw God, what would you ask God? And ultimately, this philosopher says something like, I would just ask God, kind of just let us be, leave us alone. Just, we're deeply imperfect. We're not the alpha and omega at all, but just let us be, let us be. And that's a similar sentiment. Although again, I think at least in Hard to Be a God, there's some warmth to that sentiment. Just, yes, we are deeply imperfect, but let us survive, let us be. As they go on, I think it becomes darker,
Yes.
and more pessimistic, as it is in Picnic on the Roadside Picnic, which is, again, as you put it so well, that ending is so dubious and almost can be read as a parody.
And also there's that excuse me, that similarity also, right? When one reaches the zone and then reaches this particular place, one had in mind a question one wanted to ask, but then when one finally gets there, one cannot find a question, right? Because one's confronted, perhaps with the depths of the mystery of the human heart and mind, and just what would you ask in that kind of a context? So it sounds like, right, what would you ask God? But of course, in that novel, there is a question that is posed to God, as you explained.
Right.
But it's interesting, that's enlightening that you would connect that Roadside Picnic metaphor with, for instance, Solaris, the novel by Stanislaw Lem, because that also, as you call it, right, is post-human. And I think it's very relevant. I think some of these novels should be required reading, for instance, for the staff at SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence.
Yes.
Right. And I know some of the people who work there, and some of them are, in fact, very much in tune with these types of questions and the problem that human beings are in this epistemological barrier. We think of ET as if they were like us, right? And to get outside of that box, I think sci-fi can be helpful. And I like one of the old Star Trek movies, right? So an alien probe comes to talk to whales, not humans. Or an old Outer Limits episode had an alien intelligence, quote unquote, incarnating in tumbleweeds and rocks and totally oblivious to humans.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Excuse me.
Yeah. And Lamb, of course, is kind of, very pessimistic about any possibility of contact with these with whatever is out there, right? There is a barrier that cannot be, overcome. And if you know, at the end of Solaris, there's this very interesting conversation that they have about God. Interestingly, that excerpt, that part was removed from the first translation of Solaris into Russian. That was published in the Soviet Union. It was included in the later translation that came out in the late 70s or early 80s, but in that original one, it was not, or it was extremely shortened. But ultimately, right, I think it's Calvin, that has this idea of the imperfect God.
Yes.
Right, and which again is very similar to some Kabbalistic understanding of manifestations of God, right? But this imperfect God that is not the God of Judaism or Christianity, that cares, that is invested in humanity, but that is its own thing that goes through whatever it goes, and where again the relationship with humanity is simply not really part of the equation. So yeah, I think that's again that kind of post-human element that is very much in dialogue with Judaism and Jewish mysticism, but also certainly in a polemic with it.
Yeah, well, I do recall the conclusion, it's near the conclusion, excuse me, in Solaris, and the point being, if we cannot recognize or communicate with an alien, an extraterrestrial intelligence, right? How could we wrap our minds around God? That seems right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But could we not apply that also metaphorically, even among ourselves as humans? I mean, we do communicate with each other, we recognize each other's presence, but ultimately, right, there's only so much we can communicate of ourselves, even to those dearest to us, right? Because of our singularity.
Yeah. No, that's of course. Yeah, I mean, and again, if you look at the condemned city, the Strugatsky's condemned city, where in that city somehow they all speak different languages, right? There are some who speak Chinese, some who speak Russian, but somehow they're all able to understand each other, and yet that enormous gulf remains, and especially remains between, Izya Katzman, the Jewish character, who is kind of who has this vision of the select few, who can build this kind of this intellectual structure, where somehow that wisdom and redemption can be found, but only for them, not for the rest. So yeah, that gulf absolutely remains.
Yeah. I wonder what's going on in the time wanderers, right? Between these word puns between ludens, right, which means humans, and then the homo ludens, right, the playing human or playing man, and Nelyudi, the inhumans.
Yeah.
Is that heavily political?
It's heavily political. And again, those interpretations have been done earlier. That is very much again sort of looking at how the Strugatskys, single out the select few who are essentially intrinsically different from the others, and again seeing in that kind of seeing Jewish connotations in that, but absolutely political. And again, I think in Hard to Be a God, again, there's still hope. There's still hope that the intellectuals, cultural baggage, can have an impact out of this political impasse and kind of larger sort of existential impasse. Later on, they're much they lose that hope, right? And it becomes again about the select few who need to protect themselves from the rest of essentially from the masses in order to save themselves and in order to again not save humanity or even on a larger scale, but save themselves really. Again, I think it's very kind of this very Platonic idea what the intellectuals need to do. It's also, which is why some don't like this vision of the Strugatskys is deeply elitist.
Right, like Plato.
Yes, and some would see as reactionary, and but the Strugatskys, again, why I think kind of what I call detailed allegory, for them it really takes on very concrete terms, because that's the situation that they find themselves in as writers in the Soviet Union, where they try, they compromise, they negotiate, with the regime, but there comes a point where they feel that they can't anymore. And when they write the Condemned City, again, they realize that it's absolutely just for them.
And they probably feel condemned themselves. Then.
And they probably absolutely they feel condemned themselves, right? And so, and that's kind of the Soviet intellect, or very much the Russian intellectuals, or not just intellectuals of today, right? Kind of the situation that they find themselves in, and how far are you willing to compromise when you're dealing with a regime that is evil, right? And so, unfortunately, kind of history, or at least Russian history, repeats itself.
Yes.
And they very much, even in, very much so in Monday Starts on Saturday. This idea of Russian history going backwards instead of forwards.
Right.
And yeah.
Right. At one point or at any one point, did the Strugatsky brothers have this, what I would think of as a naive sci-fi trope that we often encounter, and that is the aliens are coming to save us, right? That I know that the Wanderers, this group, this trope, right, that runs throughout some of their work, that was sort of the idea, wasn't it? But I don't get the feeling that it is so naive as a lot of this. The aliens are coming to save us that we see in a lot of very recent, I think, sci-fi,
right.
Western sci-fi.
Yeah. It's interesting because first they begin with the idea that they envision this kind of ideal communist society, right? If you look at their earlier works, and it's the humans who will save others, right? This idea of the progressors that they have.
Yes.
Right. The human civilization has advanced again to this sort of communist level, and you have these historians, the progressors, who travel to other planets, which is what we have in Hard to Be a God. And the dilemma that they face is whether they intervene when they observe these deeply imperfect societies on other planets, or they observe, right? And their job is to observe. And that's the kind of the crises that Rumata has in Hard to Be a God, right? He can't just observe. That's what he's been trying to do, but he needs to intervene. And of course, the kind of the situation on Arkanar, that planet, is deeply is just parallel to what they see happening in the Soviet Union with the collapse of the Thaw reforms, right? So originally for them, it's humanity, that will provide that salvation to others. But as I said, they certainly lose that hope. And later, but it's much more, right? It's not as simple with them, right? It's not that the aliens will come, but that, yes, there is some group, right? That, again, these select few that, but they're not saving everybody. Again, like they're sort of, they're within, they sort of stew within their own juices, and just maintain that uniqueness and that singularity. Again, this deeply sort of protectionist vision, which I think is linked to how they view, the Jewish history.
Right.
And but also kind of on an intellectual level, yeah.
Right. Well, the charge of elitism, right, in the Strugatsky brothers, does call to mind Well, I've been thinking throughout this entire conversation, actually, of Philo of Alexandria's concept of Israel as the nation of philosophers,
Yes,
right? So,
yes,
but of course, then the theological, the Jewish trope, right, of Israel as the chosen people, right, is often right made criticized also as this elitist attitude, and
right.
so, um, would you draw a connection there? Um, this type of elitism uh, in traditional Judaism, right, is being reflected in the Strugatsky brothers uh, in this way.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's tricky, right? I mean, it's very tricky because, of course, in Judaism, in rabbinic Judaism, or in the Hebrew Bible, the idea of
mhm,
choseness is is conveyed in terms of commandments, right? I
right,
mean, that's what choseness means, is that you're obligated to fulfill commandments and make yourself holy and serve as an example to the rest of the world, right? So
right,
choseness is a burden, a
right,
moral
right,
burden,
right,
and kind of an existential burden, um,
and a
and
responsibility for
a
the
kind
other.
of responsibility, precisely.
Mhm,
And the way that the Strugatskys, and that's kind of where a lot of these sort of misrepresentations of their work,
mhm.
particularly from the anti-Semitic side, and there have been so many,
Yes.
accusations thrown at them by the Soviet critics, right, who are
Mhm,
reading all this stuff and saying, oh, here is this, they're part of the Zionist cabal, they want to enslave us.
mhm.
And you look at some of the more recent readings, again, by the kind of the anti-Semitic camp of their work, in that same vein.
Mhm. Right.
And so, and there's a danger there, right? Because again, the Strugatskys, who are playing with these Jewish ideas, but not being observant themselves, right, and
Mhm.
not sort of writing within the normative, Judaic framework,
Mhm.
there is that potential for really dangerous misinterpretations,
Mhm.
right?
Sure. Sure.
Particularly if you look at their novel Inhabited Island.
Ah, yes. Mhm.
Yeah, and that's the novel that's been invoked so many times recently, uh, right? Because of, again, the sort of how similar it is to what's happening today, right? And it describes this society, this other planet, yeah, where everything is controlled by this select few, and essentially the masses are hypnotized to believe certain things, right? And they
Right.
use these towers, which some have likened to kind of the Russian television of today, that
Mhm.
sort of spew this propaganda, and so people are just conditioned to accept all these lies.
Mhm.
Uh, but the select few, right? They also all come from this kind of the downtrodden and the persecuted group in that society, kind of
Yes.
these ugly ones, the only ones who are immune to this propaganda,
Right.
right? And there you have also kind of these Jewish, sort of the Jewish similarities there, yeah.
Mhm.
But the Strugatskys, it's a complex picture that they paint, right? Because they're all also always thinking about, kind of, again, the compromises that Jews or Jewish intellectuals need to do in order to survive,
Yes. Mhm.
right? And the connection between Jews and politics. Yeah,
Mhm. Yes.
they see it as a kind of this dangerous bind. We see it in the Condemned City, where Isaac Katzman, works with this Nazi government
Mhm.
in this parallel city. We see it in Snail on a Slope.
Mhm.
When Peretz, this Jewish character, becomes the director of this kind of government, right?
Mhm.
Very much, again, this kind of totalitarian system. So anyway, they're always interested in this
Yeah, but
in this question,
yeah. Do you see that also in the Ugly Swans?
Of course.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
And just a sort of a factual question here. I'm wondering, am I reading too much into the name Yul Golem? in the
It's
Ugly
there.
Swans,
No, yeah.
right? Is that intended to evoke the Jewish golem?
I think so, definitely, because again, the golem is already in the, Monday starts on Saturday.
All right.
So they're, and yes, and then the Ugly Swans, right, were probably one of my favorite of their works, because just from a literary standpoint, it's so good. And that depiction of this city, this, where it perpetually rains, and the main character, very much this kind of alcoholic, intellectual, very much, similar to the Soviet intellectuals of the 70s. And Arkady himself, drank a lot. So there's sort of autobiographical elements there as well, right? And then in that town, again, these select few, right, who have this genetic disease and are different from everybody else, and who have such an influence on the children in the city. So that at the end, actually, the children leave and become kind of these super beings. So on the one hand, and there are so many, I've written about that, direct references to the Holocaust, and the way that these, the kind of this genetic disease is depicted. They deliberately invoke in kind of this anti-Semitic imagery that was directed against Jews. But on the other hand, they're also not morally pure, right? And again, it's fascinating, I think, but it can lead to some pretty dangerous misreadings. Which have been done with the Strugatskys, by the kind of explicitly anti-Semitic or whatever anti-Zionist, camp.
Yes, I understand. And I would imagine too that one could interpret the conflict between the generations in the Ugly Swans, right? The youth as opposed to the older generation, also as some sort of Nietzschean Superman, right? Some superhumanity that is coming, right?
Right.
I could imagine this kind of silly charge, but there's unfortunately, it's just becoming all too common. All sorts of Jewish hatred and anti-Semitic tropes.
Right.
From popular culture down. It's really distressing, but
and
so it affects exegesis as well as
absolutely
of works like the Strugatsky Brothers. All right, well, I think we've talked about quite a bit that's inspiring and fascinating and challenging. I appreciate you sharing your insights.
Thank you.
Because I'm sure the audience, a large part of the audience will have an interest in the Strugatsky Brothers via the film adaptations. Of course, I think, right? That's just of the nature of the modern world, right? Right. And one final question here, and I go back to the movie Stalker, since the Strugatsky Brothers collaborated with Tarkovsky on the script. Now, I do see a certain value in the Stalker that I also see in Tarkovsky's Solaris. That is right. This and especially comes out in the films, but this concentration on Earth, right, Mother Earth, right, and so we see these long extended scenes of the pond, right, with these long extended scenes that Americans tend, right, to find boring, right, but they seem to have the function of rooting the viewer on the Earth before the transition to outer space, so that there's now a nostalgia, a missing for Mother Earth, rather than just being titillated by outer space and the spaceships and all of this. So is there this sense of this rootedness, right, in Earth throughout the Strugatsky Brothers' work? Or is that just something that we're seeing in the films?
That's a very interesting question. My initial, at least, answer is no.
All right.
I think the Strugatskys are very, very urban. If you look at Ugly Swans or The Condemned City or Roadside Picnic, or even Monday Starts on Set. Yeah, that's where that's what they're best at. Whereas
All right.
Tarkovsky, yes, if you think about kind of the pastoral, scenes in Solaris, the father's house,
Yes.
horses, kind of, Tarkovsky's beloved. He always has, horses and dogs, in his films. And some have seen it as there's a kind of this ecological element there, but also some have read it as sort of, stemming from Tarkovsky's interest in Buddhism and kind of this union with nature, return to nature, this fusion between humanity and the natural, in the natural world. I don't see it in the Strugatskys, which is why, again, I think they deeply respected Tarkovsky, absolutely, and recognized him for what he was, but also felt that that Stalker was so different, and for the same reason, I think why Lem just absolutely abhorred
Yes.
what Tarkovsky did to Solaris, that famous when they met and when they were in Moscow, and Lem stormed out calling him an idiot and just hated that what Strugatsky did with the kind of the melodramatic, what he saw as a melodramatic element, and just again that it all came back to humanity for Tarkovsky, and that's not what Lem is is interested in. So my initial, at least initial answer is, I think that's Tarkovskian.
All right. Fair
very
enough.
Very much so. Yeah.
Yes, I would agree with you. I haven't read all of the Strugatsky Brothers novels. Probably most haven't, but I have read about a dozen, and I'm not aware of that value in what I have read. So that makes sense. So they're coming from an urban setting, so this rather makes sense. Right. So, all right, very good. Are there any closing comments that you would like to give us to sort of inspire those who have not read the Strugatsky Brothers to pick it up?
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, they're great, right? I mean, they're complex, but also it's a great read, and I teach a course, I call it Rad Sci-Fi. It's kind of Soviet science fiction, but the bulk of the course is the Strugatsky's works, and the students react very well to them. I mean, they really do. On the one hand, I mean, the Strugatskys, they're so rooted in that Soviet context. On the other hand, I think the questions that they raise and their vision is also stays deeply pertinent, for good reasons and for sad reasons. In terms of where we are. So and luckily we've had all these new translations of their works that have come out in recent years and are still coming out, and and I think also for those who are interested in Jewish literature, they're a very interesting source. I very much see them as kind of as Jewish writers.
Still a lot to be explored.
Yes. So I say just read the Strugatskys. There's a lot there.
If you enjoyed the program, please consider supporting this channel with a donation through Patreon or PayPal. And don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.